Let's talk NBA draft. Let's talk NBA draft models. And we're going to do that with Kevin Pelton of ESPN. Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and after today, this show is only going to be available to people who have iPhones. Android guys, sorry, you're out of luck. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Across the summer, sports might be winding down, but that's cool because FanDuel has you covered. It's hooking up all customers with a daily boost or a bonus. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free. We are available on all platforms. NBA Draft. Very close, isn't it? It's right here. Wednesday, 26th of June, 8 p.m. Eastern. Join me live. We go through the first round as it happens and discuss all that stuff. Big mock draft coming tomorrow as well. But today, we're talking to Kevin Pelton. So I'm not going to even go through any more of that. We'll just talk to Kevin and discuss what we're talking about. So, hey, let's get him in. Kevin Pelton, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back on.
It's good to have you here. And we're here to discuss the NBA draft, which is a couple of days away. Mainly, I've gone through a bunch of prospects, about 60 different prospects with a bunch of different draft analysts. But the main reason I wanted to get you on is because you have a draft model that you put out every year, going through draft prospects where you look at the statistical translations of all these prospects. You talk about the consensus rankings that Gavoni and Wu have, and you try to meld that stuff together to work out a way to get a different sort of approach to the draft versus the just purely scouting model. Now, first question, Kevin, is when you are putting together this draft model, how are you able to measure a player's heartbeat? Is that something that you guys have been able to do? I'm not sure if that's actually something that you can actually measure. Hang on, just a notification on my Apple Watch there. No, we're all good. So do you take that into consideration, those intangible sort of things? But on a serious note, the model, people will be like, oh, these are just a bunch of numbers. It doesn't mean anything. How does all this make sense? So what sort of factors are you taking into consideration when you're doing your stats-only translations of these players?
Yeah, it's relatively simple in theory, a little bit more complex in practice. Basically, we're looking at the history of players who have gone from college or these international leagues to the NBA. What part of their production has translated over? How much has it declined? And use that based on these players' past performance over up to the past 3 seasons to translate what they're doing at these other levels to the NBA. And then the other factor that goes into the stats only projection is what is your age. So if we know approximately how good we project you to be as a rookie and what age you are, the stats only projection is an estimate of basically how many wins above replacement player by my metric we'd expect you to produce in your first 5 years in the league. I like to use 5 years because that's generally the extent to which you control a first round pick between the rookie contract and the potential qualifying offer year for the 5th year as a restricted free agent. So I feel like that's a good time period. And then, as you mentioned, the consensus model, then that's relatively newer to my projections, although it's been a long period of time now. Adds in to all that strictly statistical where the player is in the top 100 that Gavoni and Wu do, because that just dramatically increases the predictive power. And I have to shout out, as always, Lane Vastro of the Denver Nuggets was the person who kind of really pioneered and definitely I found the same kind of predictive value that he did that is now helping the Denver Nuggets.
Yeah, Lane did a bunch of stuff with like all the individual different leagues and the strength of those leagues and the way that a lot of that stuff can translate. And Jacob Goldstein did a bunch of that stuff as well before he was headed across to the Wizards with trying to develop all-in-one metrics for all those leagues like BPM and PIPM across those leagues to try and normalize this stuff. So I guess the question that we've seen, or the thing that we've seen in recent times, Kevin, and I do my own draft modeling sort of stuff, definitely not to the same degree of yours, more focusing on the way the fantasy stats translate across. But with the advent and rise and now fall of some alternate pathways, it really threw a lot of the stuff for a loop. The overtime elite stuff, I'm glad that's gone, because that was really frustrating. Obviously, you're still dealing with, because you go back not just for the last season, you look at like high school and that sort of stuff as well, but the G League Ignite, the more prospects coming across from Australia, more prospects coming and playing in not even you're not European leagues, but like the French league, but not necessarily a French team that plays in the Euro League, or they play half the year in the juniors in the French league, or just the different sort of pathways and trying to rationalize all that. Have you found difficulties in trying to balance those different and newer pathways?
I think to a degree. I mean, the nice thing is, my projections have for a long period of time been set up to incorporate, many of these professional leagues. And even though I wasn't projecting the G League from a draft standpoint before the Ignite program started up, other than the occasional player that got kicked off his team and ended up playing like a half season in the G League or something, there has always been, a similar model to project G League stats to the NBA for, veteran non-draft picks, free agents, that sort of thing, or guys who are on two-way contracts and play more in the G League than they do in the NBA. So it isn't totally new. I mean, I think a couple of issues that sometimes crop up. Number one is when you have guys that only play a handful of games, and I think that we've seen more often in recent years, because sometimes playing games is the worst thing you can do as a draft prospect. You want to just kind of hide and hope that your potential speaks for itself. So, LaMelo Ball, I think his projection ended up pretty strong, but he played like a dozen games in the NBL, and that's all I had to go by. And then Ignite, the one question mark I do have is a team, I'm used to and we are using this for Ignite as well. We're used to translating guys who are going back and forth between kind of a standard G League team and their NBA affiliate. The Ignite, because of the fact that they're kind of built more around development than they are around trying to win games. Certainly last season, they weren't winning a lot of games. It is a little bit different. I do think, generally speaking, those Ignite projections have come out okay. There was a period of time where it felt like I maybe overvalued Jalen Green in those. Finally, the second half of last season, he started to kind of play up to that and see as a scorer. So that was nice to see. But, Scoot Henderson was someone that my model was relatively low on in terms of his immediate impact. Obviously a long ways to go in terms of his, eventual value, but year one, his G League statistics did, I think, prove pretty predictive of what he ended up doing with the Blazers as a rookie.
The G League stuff I found really interesting, and just before we get into some individual players where your model is quite different to the general consensus, there's a couple of things about the G League that I noticed. I'm not sure if you noticed this, and I want to ask one other question about the stat translation. But one thing I noticed in the G League is these guys who come through from a high school scenario and jump straight to an NBA line have really terrible three-point percentages as a general rule, and nearly all of them that I have noticed, when they come to the NBA, the three-point percentage improves 3 percentage points, 4, 5, 6, 7, and it just gets better year 1, year 2, year 3. Kuminga, Green, Daniels, even Scoot shot better. Even though he shot poorly, he still shot better than he did at the G League. And you're seeing these guys with the questions like Mbatas Bazalis and Ron Holland, who shot horribly from 3 in the G League, but that's a consistent thing. Did you notice that same sort of issue? And has that, when you look at the prospects, you go, but the G League guys, they often struggle with this increased line that is way bigger than the high school to college line, and therefore I'm not as worried about that problem. Is it something that you've noticed as well?
I haven't noticed that. You should have flagged this for me earlier. I would have looked at it, but it does strike me as consistent with something interesting that I've noticed historically at the NBA level is, generally speaking, how many years of experience you have doesn't affect your projection. So if we're comparing, I'm trying to think of someone who came into the league, really young. For Brandon Ingram, I don't know why for some reason it's popping into my head, even though I don't think he was notably young for his draft class. But like comparing him to, I don't know, someone who, came into the league relatively older. It doesn't matter. it doesn't matter years of experience. It just matters your age, except between your first and second seasons. There is a consistent jump, even for like European veterans who are coming over. And I wonder if maybe that's the same thing you're noticing, where the NBA line in particular is a jump from anywhere you are, whether you're playing high school, FIBA, college, and the G League or G League Ignite prospects are getting over that transition in the G League and not having to make it once they're in the NBA.
The European veteran one is something that I've noticed as well. So these guys come across as elite shooters and they shoot 32%. You go, what's going on? And then the next season they're at 38, 38, 38. And you go, okay, they figured it out. It just takes a year to sort of get that underneath you. And that's not with every single shooter, but that has been a consistent thing as well. So that is something that is intriguing. And one other thing I'll just mention about the stats. You talk about the way that stats translate across. Is there one, because in the past, the general idea that I have had or I've talked to people is that someone coming across into the draft with a high steal percentage usually tends to correlate to success. Not necessarily meaning they're a good defender or they're going to have a good steal rate in the NBA, but a high steal rate has usually been a good correlating factor to success in the NBA. Does that hold true with what you've seen, or is there something else that you look at and go, this is the stat that I really look at that is going to hold and carry over to success?
Yeah, it's interesting. If we're talking about carryover, I wouldn't go steal rate. I think rebound rate tends to typically be a lot more stable when you're going from one level to another. But I agree that steal rate, when you look at players who my projections differ from consensus, that's often a good first place to look, is guys who don't get as many steals as you'd think, or do get a lot. And you're right that it doesn't necessarily it's not even necessarily steal rate in the NBA in some cases. Like, I think of Tyrese Halliburton as somebody who popped very early on at Iowa State when he was a fringe draft prospect, but was already in the top 10 as my model as a freshman, maybe even the top 5. And his steal rate was a big factor in it. And, I'd have to look at it. I don't think his steal rate is exceptional now that he's in the NBA, but it was indicative of some sort of ability to read the game that I do think translates over. And in his case, it's been primarily about, his ability to play pick and roll offense.
I'm glad you brought up Tyrese Halliburton, because when you were on this show last for the 2020 draft, I asked everyone, who's the guy that you're big on? And I had about 4 people come on and say, yeah, I'm not really sure about Halliburton. The dribbles off, and you went, no, I'm big. Halliburton is the guy. Halliburton's the one that I'm in on, and I am way higher on him than everyone else, and my model loves him. And there you go. KP, you were right on that one. We're going to come back and talk about 4 different prospects where your model is quite wildly different to the way that consensus mocks are sitting. But before I do that, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. The summer is here. Most leagues, or a lot of leagues, have wound down. The NBA is over. The NHL is almost over. There's no NFL. There's no college basketball. There's no college football. Baseball's on. WNBA is there, but it's a dearth of sports. So this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every day. That is right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head across to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Don't forget to gamble responsibly. All right, so let's start to talk about these players. Because the number one guy that's going to come up, because you even put it I don't know if you put it, but the editor put it in the headlines, here's the top 30 prospects and Dalton Knecht. So Dalton Knecht in your stats only model is pretty low, because I'm going to go and assume it's because that he's 23. It's because that outside of some good shooting and scoring, the defensive numbers are low. There's no assist numbers, and basically it's profiling as a scorer who is 4 years older than probably half of the first round. Is that accurate?
Generally, I will say the age, I think, is a little bit less of a factor than people will think, because it is very possible to be an older draft prospect and come out well in the projections if the first year translation or projection is strong enough. So, in this year's draft, it's Baylor Shireman is the example of that, who's I think about 6 months older, maybe even more than that, than Connect, but ranks solidly in the top 25 in the projections because of the fact that he was somebody who really popped in the model, even before he got to Creighton. What was it, South Dakota State he was at before that? Yep. Popped back then, and also, has a really strong assist rate for a wing that stands out, whereas Connect, as you mentioned, steal rate, big indicator, The combined assists, steals, blocks numbers for him are very low. They're the lowest of anyone in the top 30. If you combine those three, at least the top 30 of Givony and Wu's rankings. So those are notable things. And then the other factor is, and as I alluded to with Shireman, one of the things that's really important in my model is earlier seasons are weighted more heavily than recent seasons. The idea being generally truly elite NBA prospects are going to show themselves by being better than their competition at younger ages, not merely when they're much older than their competition, which is what we've seen with Connect. Now, he is somewhat unique in that he has grown over the last couple of years, and I think that's a factor in why he's emerged as a prospect. I can buy that he's better than the stats only projection, which is below replacement level, would suggest. And of course, the consensus model does say that. It has him outside the top 30, but 35th, and is someone who is going to be an NBA rotation player. And I think that's sort of a fair expectation. I mean, his steal and block rates are not as low as this player, but someone I compare him to a little bit in that regard is Doug McDermott when he was at Creighton. And, someone who has carved out a long NBA career on the basis of his offensive skill, but has always sort of been limited defensively. Connect probably figures as a better on-ball defender than McDermott has been. But, McDermott really stands out because back in the day, we used to do these statistical kind of profiles or Q&As for ESPN, where we'd go and talk to players about their stats. And I remember doing this with McDermott before his rookie season when he was at Summer League with the Chicago Bulls. And his explanation for the steal and block rates was, well, look, I was the best player on the team by far. My dad, who was the coach, Greg McDermott, wanted me to stay out of foul trouble. So that's why I didn't get any steals and blocks. As it turns out, Doug McDermott doesn't get any steals or blocks in the NBA either.
Yeah, so people love. There's always an excuse for these college guys. Oh, yeah,
Exactly.
don't worry. It's the scheme. It's this. It's this. And Lee, shout out to DeAndre Hunter. Like every time, it's like, oh, don't worry. It's because of the way he plays at Virginia. And I call the Dalton Knecht scenario. It's the Ryan Anderson line. Like if you're getting less than 2 combined assists, steals, and blocks, then I'm going to have some worries about where we sit. I'm not saying that's exactly his numbers, but the Ryan Anderson line sits there 2 combined assists, steals, and blocks. That I need to be a little bit cautious about what else you're bringing, but. There'll be arguments about Connect made that he's a late bloomer, which again, it's hard to know. Are you a late bloomer or did you beat up on kids who were 5 years older than? It's really hard to know at this point because again, like you said, your model taking into account those early years, and that's the argument that I'll use often versus drafting younger guys versus older guys, is that the older guys wouldn't be in college if they were good enough to play in the NBA at a younger age. They just wouldn't be still there because they would have been drafted and everything could be doing as it needs to do with these younger prospects. But this sort of idea that this draft being a weaker draft and thinking that Connect might have, let's say a Doug McDermott career where you're 10 years as a rotation player, an elite shooter, do you look at the way that this class profiles and go, well, that actually makes him worth more in a class with so much more uncertainty?
I think I'm probably higher on this class than most people. A couple of guys we're not going to talk about because I'm not as far from consensus on them are Reed Shepard and Donovan Clingan, who both have outstanding stats only and combined projections for any draft, let alone this one. And Alex Sarr also is, there's kind of 3 guys in this draft who normally would be in the top 1 or 2. So, the statistics don't, I think, back that up. I'm not really married to that particular idea. I mean, the other thing with Connect that I think is interesting, I got some pushback on Reddit because one of the things I wrote in my breakdown of my projections the other day was the history of top 10 picks who are 22 at the age of the draft or older, and Buddy Hield is basically the best of that group.
Mm-hmm.
Before him, you have to go back to Joakim Noah in 2007 to find somebody who really became a star getting drafted that old. And I do think it is possible that you're going to have to adjust that, that mental frame going forward because of NIL. But I think it's going to be more with guys who are dominating early on and still just staying in college because they don't translate or scouts haven't bought it. Like, again, Shireman or Zach Edey would be a terrific example, who's 4th overall in the consensus projections this year, and even higher than I would probably have him subjectively, knowing his limitations as a player. But the other thing that kind of tells me is what you were saying about, is this because you've actually improved or because you're just taking advantage of the experience gap? Well, scouts haven't been able to figure out which of these guys are doing that.
That's true.
So I don't know that I'm convinced they're going to do it with Connect, because there are a lot of older players that come into the league and are successful right away. Your Jaime Jaquez Jr. type. But historically, those have been guys who have gone either in the middle of the first round like Hawkes or even into the second round if it's a Herb Jones.
This is the thing that I wrestle with a lot with this, is that like, I've talked about this plenty of times, is that older players picked in the lottery or picked in the top 10, like they stink. Like nearly every time any of them are picked there, it's like, oh no, what are you doing? Chris Duarte stinks. O'Shea Abaji, not a good pick. Like all of these guys, they've been bad in that spot. Yet then if you want to counter that argument, you say, but look at these older players. Jalen Brunson, look where he was picked. Look how successful he was. Desmond Bain was picked at pick 30. He was an older player. Okay, that's true. But there's obviously something off with the way that happens. And these are usually like outlier developmental pathways when they get to the NBA, because if anyone thought of them as being that good of a player, then no one would have actually cared about the age at that point. So you can pick those examples out, but you could also pick out the example of 6 other guys that were picked 10 spots around Jalen Brunson who were the same age, who played 5 minutes combined in the NBA. Like that example is there, but like the success of the older guys is usually the weird outliers who are picked at 30 or whatever, and then blow up out of nowhere. And I find it hard to sort of wrestle with how to judge that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say is I think the assumption is, well, these older players are safer, but they don't have very much upside. Yeah. So that's why teams take younger players, because they could be anything. They could even be a boat. And in actuality, a lot of times players who have produced well as freshmen are much safer bets than somebody who didn't start producing well until they're an upperclassman. But at the same time, even though you have slightly fewer years of development as an older player and the average development is lower, there's enough of variance from player to player that you can be a Jalen Brunson and come into the league and have this dramatic improvement once you come into the league, or you could be a 19-year-old who comes into the league and doesn't work hard and doesn't improve at all. So, I think neither of those kind of NBA draft truisms quite bears out.
I agree completely. That old adage of like, we'll take the NBA ready player. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. Shout out to Hunter Tyson, Jalen Pickett, and Julian Strawther. All right.
Give him time.
Yeah.
Give him time.
One day we'll get there. We're going to talk about these last 3 guys that we've got here, Kevin, and we might as well just get straight into the next one, because this is one that your system is higher on than the consensus, and it's great because initially when people know the process that I go through to put together my draft board, is that like I don't really touch much stuff while the NBA season's on, then it's off, and then I go through and I translate about 100 different prospects stat-wise, start looking at it, then put it together, and I was really in on Johnny Furphy. I went, all right, straight away, bang, he's in the lottery. And then I started to look at other people. No one's interested. Also, shout out to Johnny Furphy. I found out he went to school like 5 minutes from me around the corner, which I had no idea.
I was going to say, is that a factor in the projections?
When I first looked at it, I didn't know he was from Australia, let alone know that he was from Melbourne, or let alone went to school with kids that I coached playing footy. I had no idea. I found this out last night that he went to a school around the corner. I went, I actually know people who know you, and I had no idea about that. But I just looked at him and went, this is really interesting here from Johnny. Like I like this size, I like this shooting ability, I like this cutting, I like a lot of these things, and your model likes him as well. Because I've got the numbers up on the screen, like 15 points, 8 rebounds per 40 minutes, pace adjusted, it's not super. 1.4 steals is not great, like it's 18 usage. Like what's good about him?
Yeah, I mean, I think the shooting is the main appeal, the combination of shooting and size at that age, I think. And the 3-point percentage doesn't necessarily project outstanding in and of itself, but pretty decent volume for that age. And certainly when you compare him to a lot of the guys in this year's draft, question marks are about their shooting. And then a really high 2-point percentage, I think good selectivity. He's a little lower usage, and that tends to be something that, my model probably puts less weight creation than scouts in particular do. I've kind of found it fascinating. I didn't realize how negative the reaction was to Johnny Furphy as a draft prospect until the last few days, where I keep everyone's saying, yeah, everyone doesn't like Johnny Furphy, but he comes out great in Kevin Pelton's model, which was fascinating because when I watched him play, my thought was, look, he's really big. Mm-hmm. He can shoot it. He can handle it a little bit.
He rebounds.
That he can hold his own defensively. That combination almost always works in the NBA. I mean, I think Trey Murphy III is sort of like a not a best case, but a good end scenario for what Furphy could eventually be.
How did you you maybe don't know this, but how did Murphy look in your models? Because I remember he looked really good in mine when I did them when he came out, even though he was 21 at the time. How did he look in those models?
Yeah, I think he was in the low teens and the early teens, so a little bit higher than he went. Not probably high enough for me to be like standing on a soapbox shouty about him, but enough that I can feel good about the projection now.
So Furphy's a guy, again, I think part of it, again, with me in this class, I look at the guys that are projected in that range, and I go, yeah, none of these guys are going to shoot. Like, there's Jared McCain, but he's like 6'2" or whatever he is, and then there's I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure who the next guy is that's going to be in this area who's able to shoot. And I think Furphy's, again, he's
maybe
got that
Jacoby
size.
Walter.
Yeah, maybe, but like, he worries me a lot. Like, he worries me of the guy that's just taking a bunch of shots in college and they're sort of going in, but maybe I don't know. Like Keyshawn George, maybe. It's a weird area in the draft. So I was glad to see that when we went look through it and said, oh, Furphy looks really high in yours, and you're probably the only person outside of me who's had him consistently at the back end of the lottery that actually thinks that he can turn into a solid enough starter / role player who's going to project to a really usable NBA skill. So yeah, that's great. Love that. All right, next guy, Cody Williams. We know that his brother was a massive late riser in his draft process. So I do think there is a bump that is given in that scenario to Cody. Obviously, the way they are as players is extraordinarily different. Jalen Williams, huge wingspan guy, big defensive stat generator, event creator, ball handler. Cody doesn't do any of those things. Now, Cody Williams started the season shooting about 50% from three, suffered multiple injuries. Everything dropped off as the season went on. And then, again, I look at his numbers and go, okay, you've got the age is great, the size is great, the positional value is great. But, like, what are we doing here? Like, the rebound numbers are putrid. The assist numbers, he doesn't create. He doesn't provide defensive numbers. He's not a good defender. I'm not really sure what his skill is at the moment. Maybe it is shooting, but am I going to buy a 10-game sample size? I'm not really sure. In fact, I'm probably almost definitely not going to do that. So you are like, there's whispers of him going top 5, top 7, top 10 or whatever. And I look at it and go, yeah, it just feels like he's doing a bunch of nothing looking at the numbers, and certain games that he plays, he's great. Some are not. So what's the concern that you have with the Cody Williams projection, or what's the thing that stands out where you have some sort of red flags going off?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I should probably note here is my model was not particularly high on Jalen Williams, so that was definitely a miss for me. So, I do think Cody is probably getting a lot of credit for that coming in, and you can see the appeal. You mentioned his positional size, like when he did play on the ball at Colorado, which wasn't a lot because KJ Simpson was so terrific for them in that role. He could post up smaller defenders at times. When he got into the paint, it was helpful in terms of his finishing. His 2-point percentage was a real positive, but it just wasn't making enough happen on the court, I think, was the biggest question mark. And the interesting thing, I could buy the injury as an explanation a bit more, but Cody Williams didn't project all that well for me based off of his Nike EYBL stats, which are a component of these projections. So that set him apart from, I think there's a group of guys that are really interesting because they came into this year as top 10 prospects, didn't perform particularly well in their freshman season, and teams are sort of figuring out where to slot them, much like with Nick Smith, I guess, would be a good example of this a year ago, or maybe even Cam Whitmore to a degree where he ended up going, I guess. But Isaiah Collier and Justin Edwards are the two others I would fit into that group, and Collier was number one based strictly off the EYBL performance for me of guys who played in that competition. Edwards was number 3 with Jared McCain in between them, and Cody Williams out of that group. There's 11 guys who have projections based just off the EYBL performance. He was 8th of that group.
The track record of those high-level recruits who struggle through college is not particularly strong. You mentioned Nick Smith. Like, my name will always go, or my brain will always go to Nasir Little. It will go to Cam Reddish. It will go to Scal Labissiere. Like, I'm sure there's other examples of guys who, actually, maybe there's not, of guys who are highly ranked prospects in high school, struggled in college, and then really succeeded in the NBA. But I struggle to think of many of them, and but they always seem to get more benefits of the doubt. Maybe less so now. We saw the Nick Smith slide. Justin Edwards has never been talked about in the first round this year. So that is interesting to see. Maybe there is a slight adjustment to the way that those people or the way that scouts and teams are viewing that fall off, or the way that they have struggled through a college setting. What do you make of this scenario of Colorado maybe having, let's say, 3 top 40 picks with Simpson and De Silva along with Williams, and the fact that was that team A, good, and then B, the reason for your Cody having this lower usage, like 20% usage, and sort of just floating around and not doing enough, is that because those other guys are there, or do you think that when we're viewing prospects that you want, like if even though there's other good players on the team, you want him to be standing out? He's going to be the guy picked first out of that trio. So why wasn't he doing more at that sort of a level?
Yeah, I mean, KJ Simpson I'd put in a little bit different category for me, because that's someone who I think was a really good college player, particularly last season. And just, we'll see how well that translates to the NBA in terms of him being in that kind of on-ball role. But De Silva, I would say that I'm probably even lower on as a prospect than Cody Williams.
I'm very low.
Similar to Connect in terms of late bloomer, in terms of skills, not a lot of, not doing a tremendous amount to fill out the box score. I think the stat, I forget who it was, but there's a guard in the draft who has a higher block rate than, might have been Reed Shepherd, has a higher block rate than Tristan De Silva, which is a little disconcerting. So I wouldn't say De Silva is a big factor in it, but I can buy that with Simpson, like it was an unusual situation where most of the time a player as good a prospect as Cody Williams would go in and have the ball in his hands all the time, and he just didn't because of Simpson.
Yeah, look, there's obviously your stats will tell one thing, and we've got this bunch of predictive power, but stats are nothing, Kevin, unless there's outliers. Like that's just the way it works. Nothing is going to hit exactly on the mark every time. Like we can have, say 90% correlation of this stat meaning this, but that means that there's a bunch of things that sit on the outside and go way above or well below, and picking those ones out is where the interesting things start to develop. We've got one more guy that I want to cover off here, and it is a player that when I first started looking into him, I went, I'm really interested here. I'm really interested in Cam Christie, because I get much. It's very similar to Johnny Furphy. Like you are young, you've got size, you play a position of need, and you can shoot. And I haven't really seen any buzz about Cam Christie. In fact, there were people who were, I won't say surprised, maybe I will say surprised. They were surprised that he was even staying in the draft and not going back to school. So Christie's brother plays for the Lakers, Max, at the moment. Is it just a lot of the Johnny Furphy stuff recycled here with Cam?
Yeah, I think definitely some similarities. I'm glad you mentioned position of need, because I think that's one thing that's kind of hard for people to square sometimes, is like it's easy to see how productive Zach Edey and Donovan Clingan were. The way that the college game is, and to a lesser degree the NBA game, it's just so heavily weighted with the shooting right now towards being able to dominate as a big man and put up good stats that it's much more difficult. Like the bar for what qualifies as good statistical performance for a wing is totally different than what it is for a big man at the college level. So Christie, age, an even bigger factor than it is with Furphy. He's one of the youngest players in this draft, along with Tijon Salon and Bub Carrington. I think those are the three guys that are going to be...
Ron Holland too.
Yeah, those guys will be under 19 at the time of the draft. Holland, 18. I have him, it's 18.8. Those guys at 18.7 at the end of the college season. So that's a big element in it. You mentioned the shooting. Christie, to me, is one of those guys where I'd be really intrigued if a second team early in the second round gave him a promise. I've always felt this is a real opportunity for teams where, particularly with the guys that pop in a model like this, often what we see is, year one, they kind of fly under the radar. If they go back for year two, all of a sudden, that's when they start playing up to the projection a little bit and getting that buzz. Halliburton was an example of this. Like I said, he popped immediately at Iowa State back when Taylor Horton Tucker was the big draft prospect on that team. And I forget they had a wing who ended up playing for the Sixers as well. I forget his name, but Halliburton, and then year two, he comes back. He's the star of that team, plays well in the U19s for the USA. And all of a sudden he's being talked about as a top 10 pick, even though he didn't eventually go in the top 10. But you could have potentially gotten a guy like that late in the first round if you would have promised him after the freshman season. And there's some risk with that, certainly, but a lot of upside.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this on the show with a couple of people as well, is that the NBA roster setup makes it harder to sort of sit on developmental prospects. It's harder to just sit and go, well, we're just going to sit on you for a year and you're 18 and we'll see where this goes, because people often just want some sort of immediate impact. And even like Cam's brother in LA, like Max Christie's barely played, but like he's just been sort of working in the back. I think he's going to be useful. BJ Boston for the Clippers. Like these are guys you've had that development time, but that's a rarity. And now like it's almost like, oh, BJ's been around for 2 years. Like, Yeah, who knows? Like, is anyone going to use him? Is he just going to wash out of the NBA? It's the roster setup and development, and the G League makes it harder to sit on those sort of prospects along those ways. We talked about age, and I just want to touch on one guy. And I haven't given you pre-warning about this, Kevin, but how did you find the statistical translation for the youngest player in this draft, old mate Ulrich Chomchi from the NBA Academy in Africa, who's like turning 19 in like December 30th, the old GG Jackson special, who the only real games we can see are the 3 games that he played in this random scenario against like Cape Town and someone else over in Africa, where the numbers look really great, but I have no idea. I have no idea what to do with it, apart from like watching the games and going, yeah, it looks pretty good, but the stats stuff is so hard to sort of work out.
Yeah, I don't have a projection for him because there's no translation for that league. So I think that is one where you just kind of have to rely heavily on the eye test. And you get a few of those. You mentioned OTE and how nice it is that they're not sending players directly to the NBA anymore. I didn't have a projection last year for the Thompson twins. I think if I had gone through enough effort, maybe I would have been able to find some way, but I wouldn't have been super confident in it. And I would definitely have no confidence whatsoever in Chomche playing a handful of games against a certain level of competition.
Yeah, so the OTA stuff last year was hard, and I tried to work out a translation model, and then I sort of settled on something that I was okay with, and then basically, like as a cheat, I used that same translation on the NBA Africa Academy numbers of Chomchi to see like how it would look. I'm sort of okay with it, but like literally it's one player who played 3 games over in this situation. I've got nothing to test it against. So I guess we will find out. The thing going for him is he's like 18 and a half, and we'll see where that ends up. But Kevin, I have kept you long enough here. So thank you for coming on and discussing your NBA draft model, what goes into it, the things that are valued by it, the things that are valued by NBA teams, and just some interesting players to keep an eye on. You got any more content on the draft coming out before the draft over at ESPN, or is it all coming out after?
Not the draft specifically. The last piece I have scheduled right now is something looking at the Atlanta Hawks' possible pathways this offseason. Should be out on Tuesday. But I will be part of the Hoop Collective live stream covering the NBA draft on Wednesday night. So if everyone can be sure to check that out on YouTube, Twitter, and then also the ESPN app. So lots of opportunities to watch that.
Kevin, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about the NBA draft with me.
Thanks for having me.
And that will do it for us in today's show. That sounded weird. Don't know why that sounded so weird. Go and check out the mock draft I did yesterday. And there is one coming tomorrow. Full 58 picks, dynasty tiers included. A whole bunch of stuff happening over there. The NBA draft is just 2 days away. Leave your comments down below. Thumb it up. Subscribe. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.